So I recently had a tournament where I was throwing to cover with a Texas rig and a small jig using a pitch and a roll cast. It's something I do a lot. I catch a lot of fish on it, but I've never really showed you my setup for doing that. So I wanted to show you guys typically what I use and what my setup is for pitching and roll casting small Texas rigs and jigs to cover. Well, first off, let's talk about why this technique is so good. It's something that I use all the time because it is such an efficient way to catch fish. If you're not catching them on a hard bait like a spinner bait or a crankbait, a lot of times you can go in there with a little Texas rig or a jig and just use that little pitch or roll cast to throw in there and really pick apart that cover. If you're going down a bank that's got some laydowns or some stumps or maybe some grass or some docks and things like that, very efficient way to catch fish. And a lot of times if you go in behind someone that was just throwing a hard bait, you can catch a few more fish that they didn't using this technique. The reason it's so good is because you're throwing it low to the water. It's a subtle presentation, and a lot of times it goes in right by the cover and they just can't stand it. It reacts. The fish reacts right to it. So that's why it's such a good technique. And you can throw a lot of different baits on it. I like to throw little creature baits and little jigs and things like this, but that's not as important as the rod and reel and line setup. You gotta have high quality rod and reel for this setup. And I love to use a 7-foot rod. 7-foot rod seems to be the perfect length for doing this technique. You've still got the leverage for pulling the fish out of the cover, but it's going to give you the casting accuracy that you're going to need making that little pitch or roll cast to get up under that cover or right inside somewhere that no one else has been that day. So 7-foot medium heavy action is what I like to use. And I like something with a fast tip. And the reason you want a fast tip is because you want that rod to load up at the very end so that it's going to give you a little bit more accuracy flipping this little bait around, doing that roll cast, or when you pitch up under the dock or whatever it may be. So you're going to have the accuracy and you're going to have the leverage using the 7-foot medium heavy action rod. This one I'm using here, this is my favorite. This is the Dobyns 704. This is an Extreme Series rod, so it's very light, very sensitive, and I can feel those bites very well on this rod. And that's very important. A lot of times you're getting the bites just like that when you throw in there. The fish will react to it. You're usually fishing about 1 to 10 feet of water, so as soon as you throw down that dock post or into that little vegetation or in that little rock transition, the fish is going to grab it and it's going to take off. And if you don't have a real sensitive rod, you may not even feel the fish. And you really have to pay attention to your line too. So I like this rod. I like a high quality reel too. I like to use a little bit lighter reel. This is actually a Shimano Core, which is a really light reel. And this setup right here is super light. It's something that I can use all day and not get fatigued, and that's important. A lot of times when you're pitching and roll casting, you're doing it a lot. Very frequent cast. Little pitch here, little roll cast, boom, 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 boom. If you're doing that, you know, a few hundred times a day with a little bit heavier rod and reel, it can get tiring. So I like to use a little bit lighter setup. Now line, also very important. You want to make sure you have a sensitive line on there, a high quality fluorocarbon, for example. I actually like to use braid. I use 40 to 50 pound braided line, and I also use a 20 to 25 pound fluorocarbon leader tipped onto that. And I use a uni to uni splice knot on that connection. So I use about a 4 to 5 foot pure fluorocarbon leader. I like to use Seaguar fluorocarbon. If you're familiar with the Blue Label brand, it's pure fluorocarbon. It's not meant for going onto the spool of your reel. It's just for leader material. So it's very pure. There's very, very little imperfections in it, and I seem to have the best luck with that. So that is basically the line, reel, and rod setup. Let's talk about some baits. Well, as I said before, the baits are not near as important as the rod and reel and line combo, and also your presentation. You want to make sure you're making good, accurate casts into the cover. That is going to be the most important thing. But these are the typical baits that I will use when I'm pitching and making roll casts around cover. And I try to keep it pretty simple. I either go with lighter or darker colors, either like a watermelon to a green pumpkin to a darker color like a June bug or black and blue or black and red, just depending on water clarity. The clearer the water, the lighter the color I'm going to use. The darker the water, the darker the color I'm going to use. And same thing goes with the style of bait. The more water dispersion a bait puts out, the better it is in the dirtier water. So a bait like this is going to be really good in the dirtier water conditions. A bait like this, like a tube, is going to be better in a clear water condition because it's a lot more subtle. But these are the typical baits I'll throw. The first one here, LFT Baby Creature. This is one I've caught a ton of fish on. Works pretty much everywhere, and it's got 2 boot tails, a grub tail, and these ribs on it. So it's putting out a lot of water dispersion, but it's also pretty compact, so you can present the bait around decently heavy cover. You can't put it in real thick cover because of the legs, but you can put it around sparse cover, and the fish are going to take this one pretty easily. It's pretty small, but it puts out a lot of water dispersion. Tube, real subtle bait. This is really good on a erratic, quick pop presentation, hop, pause. I like this in the clear water. Craw tube, very similar, just has these crawl legs on it, and this is not as erratic, but it really looks like a crawfish in the water, and I can get this in some nasty stuff if I need to. This is a hyperworm. I can go down the bank super quick with this thing, and because it has this little paddle tail on it, it's almost like a little swim bait, and I can pitch it to the piece of cover, say a standing tree, and it'll flutter down to the bottom, and almost like a spinnerbait blade would, and puts out a lot of thump. But if you're on a lake that has fish that are more tending to bite the worm style baits, then that one tends to work a little bit better. And this other one is LFT Flipper, and I really like this bait over the beaver style baits because of these rudders right here. I think I've talked about this before in another video, but when you move this bait through the water, these legs will stay closed because of the rudders, and when you stop the bait, they'll open up like that. And that defensive posture from a bluegill or a crawfish, that's what this looks like. So that's why I really like this bait. And this is the actual setup that I was using in the tournament a few weeks ago. And I used either a 3/16 or a 1/4 ounce weight. You know, you can go all the way up to like a 3/8 or a half, just depending on how deep of water you're fishing or the reaction speed the fish want it. But just use a little bobber stopper on there. And depending on the size bait, it depends on what kind of hook you want. This is just an offset worm hook, a little 4/0 offset worm hook. And pretty hard to beat green pumpkin most of the time if you guys are wondering about colors. Pretty hard to beat that color right there. And of course I already told you about the line setup and everything, but those are the baits that I typically use. I try to keep it simple, and those tend to work for me. That is my setup for pitching and roll casting to cover. Guys, if you haven't yet mastered that technique of pitching and roll casting, you need to get out there and practice it, because it's an excellent way to go in behind someone and catch a few more fish, and on a tournament day, that can mean a whole lot. So practice it, get it down. I think you'll find yourself catching a few more fish. And tight lines, I'll see you next time.